Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live. Talk radio without the static. Email your questions and comments to lynncullenshow@gmail.com. And now your host, Lynn Cullen.
Well, I always manage to find some way to muck things up. I knocked the show off the air before we even began, which is why we're starting just a tad late. It took me a while to figure out how to get this back up and on. We are, aren't we? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, I think so. Anyway, yike. Guys, I'm going to start with something positive. Can you imagine? And it's from the mouth of a man who I don't think of as a Pollyanna type or a glass half full type or any of that. And it's something that he wrote, I think, to calm some of us down, certainly me. And I'm speaking of James Carville, who said this: "It's going to be okay." He says Harris will be elected. That's what he says. And then he goes on to say, "Of this, I am certain." And then he proceeds to explain why. He has three main reasons, and they are all heartening. First of all, he reminds us that Donald Trump is something that he so does not ever want to acknowledge he is, which is a loser. He's a loser. And he has been on a losing streak since his first and only win. And I needn't reiterate, it wasn't just losing to Joe Biden, it was losing in the midterm election. Just 2 years into Trump's presidency, Americans resoundingly voted for Democrats. It was the largest House landslide for Democrats in a midterm election since Watergate. And as you know, he lost the last election. And Democrats have been performing really well in special elections, in the abortion referenda, even in red states. And Carville goes on to say there simply do not seem to be enough voters who turn out at Trump's behest anymore. He has not learned from his mistakes. He has not reached out to try to assemble a broader base. And he's old, and he clearly is more erratic. So that's number one. Let us remember that the American people have, ever since experiencing 2 years of Donald Trump as president, repudiated him and his party at the polls. Also, Carville acknowledges that while Trump is not in any way trying to grow his base, Kamala Harris has created the most extraordinary coalition Carville says in modern political history, from AOC to Dick Cheney, for God's sake. So that's number one. Number two is an unhappy one as far as I'm concerned, and it is that, as Carville says, in American politics, money matters. And he says, look, if that weren't the case, then you got to ask, why are people then wasting so much time trying to raise it? And Harris and the Democrats are just outraising Trump and the Republicans in fundraising. Elon Musk not making up the difference, all the other, billionaires in his pocket. I won't go into the specifics of who's raised what because it depresses the hell out of me. And then Carville says this, and it's something that I think all of us can say, but are fearful of doing so lest we put the jinx on it. He says, and finally, I think that she will win because it's just a gut feeling I have, and it's 100% emotional. And I will read what he says because it is uplifting. We are constantly told that America is too divided, too hopelessly stricken by tribalism to grasp the stakes of this election, and that is plain wrong. If the Cheneys and AOC get that the Constitution and our democracy are on the ballot, every true conservative and every true progressive should get it too. A vast majority of Americans are rational, reasonable people of goodwill. Carville writes, I refuse to believe that the same country that has time and again overcome its mistakes to bend its future toward justice will make the same mistake twice in electing Donald Trump. America overcame him in 2020, and Carville says, I know that we are better than this. He is a loser. He is going to lose again, and it is highly likely that there will be no other who can carry the MAGA mantle in his wake. Of that, I'm not so sure. But there's James Carville, who certainly knows politics, the game of it, and reading the populace. And he says in 2 weeks, we will have a chance to bring finality to the sordid career of Donald Trump. Let us hope. That's all I can say. Let us hope. And as we are hoping, let us feel a bit buoyed by the fact that more and more proof of Trump's vileness, his, I can't even call it character, that the reality of his unfitness for any office in this country, let alone the presidency. So you have these two blockbuster pieces that came out yesterday. One in the Atlantic, and the other, I believe, is the New York Times, with Trump's former chief of staff and Homeland Security Director, General James Kelly, speaking out about Trump and what he saw. And Goldberg's piece in the Atlantic is of the same stuff. Really well researched, hard to, well, of course, Trump's camp is saying it's a lie, it's not true. But since all they do is traffic in lies, we can, of course, assume that they saying it's a lie is a lie. And too many trusted people are saying that both these reports are true as can be. And they're simply, some of it we've heard before, but James Kelly, who served Donald Trump as his chief of staff, who spent countless hours with him in the Oval Office and observing him and listening to him and watching him. And he was constantly appalled. Constantly appalled. And he now has joined General Milley. And let's just say right off the bat, generals, first of all, we know, do not tend to be political. It's against sort of the rules. They also tend to be relatively conservative in their politics. So when somebody like John Kelly, a Marine general, who served as chief of staff to Trump longer than anybody else, he told himself, and this is said in the article, that he was not going to speak out other than what he had previously said, maybe in an interview here and there. And he felt, again, that generals, that military sense of reluctance to engage in politics. And in fact, he said, in many cases, I would agree with Trump's policies. So he was, by nature, politically conservative. But he saw Trump up close. And he said, this is a man who is unfit for office. And he had told himself, I am not getting involved in the election. It's not my place. And he told himself that the only way he would was if something in fact Trump did or said was so over the top that he would feel a patriotic need to speak out. And it was Trump's saying relatively recently that he would use the military against what he calls the enemy within, which is, of course, you, me, anyone who does not aid and abet him. And when General Kelly heard that, and knowing Trump, knowing that he had wanted to use the military on American citizens, knowing that his saying that meant he meant it, Kelly then decided, I must speak out. And he says, I think this issue of using the military on American citizens is one of those things I think is a very, very bad thing. He's no orator, General Kelly. I mean, even to say it for political purposes to get elected, he says, I think it's a very, very bad thing, let alone actually doing it. And he recounts how when he was chief of staff, over and over, he had to tell this nitwit Trump that he could not use the military as he wanted to. And he, like all the other generals that found themselves serving in his administration, were appalled by his constant referral to them as my generals. And he called them that because he really thought they were. That their fealty, that their loyalty was to him. And more than one of them, Milley included, Kelly included, told him and then had to tell him again that they take an oath not to him, but to the Constitution. And Kelly says this, he is certainly the only president that has all but rejected what America is all about and what makes America America. In terms of our Constitution, in terms of our values, the way we look at things to include family and government, he is certainly the only president that I know of, certainly in my lifetime, that was like that. He just doesn't understand the values of America. He pretends he talks, but he doesn't. And of course, he went on to say how Trump did, in fact, on more than one occasion, call anyone who was killed or maimed, grievously injured in the service of the United States was a loser and a sucker. Now, here's what I cannot comprehend. How do people who wave the flag as aggressively as they do, Trump's base, people who consider themselves Republican, how do they vote and support and worship a man who thinks all those dead in Arlington and in military cemeteries in Europe and all over this country, who thinks every last one of them was a sucker? How does anybody, how does a veteran get past that? And hearing these generals say, I heard him say it more than once. He said it all the time. He literally can't comprehend why anyone would die or put themselves in mortal danger for anything other than themselves. He is incapable of comprehending it. So, like so many other things that we all wrestle with now, where we feel ourselves incapable of comprehending how other Americans who think of themselves as patriots could cast a vote for a man who has time and time again clearly voiced his disdain for those who have served this country. These articles, the Atlantic article, the New York Times article, are just filled with quotes from people who heard him say these things, and where one person said it, another person in the room corroborates. Yes, he said that. The soldier who was bludgeoned to death during his tenure, a woman, bludgeoned to death by a fellow soldier, a man. She was Mexican American, and I'm sure you've heard this by now. Trump told her family, I will pay for the funeral. I will pay. Well, like so many times before, he, of course, did not. And when he was told what the funeral cost, he went ballistic and said something to the effect of, it can't cost that much to bury a fucking Mexican. A fucking Mexican sucker, loser, for wearing the uniform of this country. It's really incomprehensible. And Goldberg's article goes into his adulation of Adolf Hitler. And his absolute lack of any knowledge of American history. And we come back to this sense of incredulity that we all share. How can Americans, with their precious votes, use those votes to put this man, this boy man, this damaged man, into the White House? Who are we living with? Right before the show started, I saw who apparently Trump says he's interested in serving as his attorney general if he gets in. It won't surprise you. Think of somebody wholly unfit for the position. but who clearly exhibits the one qualification that matters to Donald Trump, and that is constant fidelity. Yeah, Judge Eileen Cannon, one of the judges he put very prematurely, since she had no experience, onto the federal judiciary, who has been sheltering him and shielding him from the force of the law that she took an oath to uphold. Disquieting news, too, today about, and this is our intelligence people blowing the whistle, that in fact the Russians, not surprisingly, are doing what they did in the last two presidential elections, which is trying anything they can to get their puppet, Donald Trump, back into the White House. You may have heard about that totally bogus thing that's smearing Tim Walz. Supposedly, it's a supposed former student of his, now a grown man, uh, talking directly into the camera and talking about how Coach Walz abused him. Our intelligence now has determined that it comes directly from Russia. It has been seen and passed around on social media millions and millions of times. And whether or not the people who saw it will find the truth, which is the man on camera is not who he says he is. The name he uses is the name of a man who was a student at the time that Walz was a coach and teacher. And that man, who lives in Hawaii, is appalled and, of course, says no such thing ever happened. It's the Russians. And this is one that has been found out. This is one we know of. But even more disquieting is that U.S. intelligence officials say that Russia is intending to foment violence in the period directly after November 5th and through to the inauguration date of January 20. And it's not just Russia, but probably Russia more than any other. It's Russia, it's China, it's Iran, and they're fully intending to be putting out disinformation about rigged elections. This is, of course, assuming that she wins. And this was all classified intelligence up until just days ago when it was declassified. Russia behind so much of this stuff of immigrants voting fraudulently, which isn't true. The State Department has announced a $10 million reward for any information helping them identify and locate people working for this Russian disinformation campaign. In fact, it's a media operation that was founded by, maybe you'll recall this name, Yevgeny Prigozhin. That was the one-time Putin ally who then, because of the war in Ukraine being badly run, actually marched toward Moscow and, of course, now is dead. But the kinds of operations that he put in place are still in place. They're just being run by others. Some of the hashtags they know that this group uses are Stand with Texas, Hold the Line. My God. A lot of the stuff that Americans living in that alternative reality created by right-wing Putin and Trump-loving media are feeding our fellow Americans, which might help us in our efforts to try to comprehend what the hell they are thinking in supporting this traitor. Russian officials use videos in which people speak directly into a camera, and then they help them go viral on social media. This is what they did with this walls smear, but they do it in many other cases as well. And the fact that now, through artificial intelligence, you can have people that you know, that you recognize, identify, and maybe even trust, looking directly into the camera and telling you things, which, because you know them and trust them, you will believe, when in fact, it's phony. Anytime someone now says anything to me, like, gives me a statement of, did you hear blah, blah, blah? And then I will say, no, where'd you hear that? It was on the internet. And I mean, stop right there. If we don't all get really media literate fast, and I'm not even sure how we manage that when there are so many abilities out there by technologically smart people to manipulate things so that you cannot believe your eyes. You cannot believe your ears. And again, this is how you disrupt an election. This is how you take down a democracy. Okay, time for a happier story. Did you hear about the judge? His name is Frederick Block. He's in New York. And he's 90 years old and he's still working. See, now we would say now, well, that's too old, get him out. But thank God he's still working because he did something wonderful. He gave a man back his life, a man who he had put in prison forever. Remember that 3 strikes you're out law? That punitive, cruel law? that maybe the third time you got caught and convicted of shoplifting, you were in for life? Yeah. Oh, yeah. There are still people rotting away for decades in our prisons who ran afoul of that 3 strikes law. And a guy named Walter Johnson was one of them, and his crimes were worse than shoplifting. So in 1997, when he stood in front of Judge Block for sentencing, he had been convicted of robbery, of cocaine possession, witness tampering, and that wasn't the all. He had a history of crimes, violent crimes, gun crimes, robberies. I mean, he was in and out and in and out and in and out, and he had 3 strikes and then some. And Judge Block said, "You are a classic example of a person who has to be incapacitated so society is protected against you." And he gave Walter Johnson 5 life sentences. Last week, Judge Block said that the sentence that he had imposed 27 years ago was too harsh. It had weighed on his mind. And he said it was a result of his own inexperience and of lousy laws like 3 strikes. And so he freed the guy. He said, "You've served enough." And he didn't just free any guy. He obviously looked at how Walter Johnson had been doing for the last 27 years with no hope of ever being free again, and found that his disciplinary record was stellar, that he immersed himself in prison programs, that he helped other inmates, and that he was motivated by this idea that even if he dies in jail, he wanted to be the guy who tried to make a change in other people's lives. Judge Block said, "You're free." And Judge Block said this: "Judges gain insights that with the passage of time only can come with experience on the bench, and also their judicial maturation. Just like prisoners who have evolved into better human beings during their lengthy periods of incarceration, judges can also evolve with the passage of years on the bench." That article made me happy. It also made me, of course, think of all the people who were in jail who have served more time than they ever needed to, who also have exemplary records, who pose absolutely no danger to any of us, and who should be released. But saying that, I want to talk about something I read about this morning. I feel, I've told you this, I feel really bad about not being as up on local news as I used to be. But I want to talk about the fact that I am aware that this state what was he? He was a state law enforcement officer. And he was brutally murdered on the Montour Trail recently, like a few days ago. The guy who was murdered is named Benjamin Bralier, and he was, I didn't know that, a liquor enforcement officer. So we have all these, varying ways of being a law enforcement, and I guess that's working essentially for the state liquor control board. He was a husband, a father, and an avid jogger, and he was doing what he does early in the morning, jogging on the Montour Trail, and he was killed. And they found a guy relatively quickly, covered in blood, a 25-year-old. But here's the thing. This guy, the 25-year-old, had been in trouble with the law many times before. He was charged with a mugging in Point State Park in 23, and he was released without monetary bail by one of the magistrates, the magisterial district judge in Lawrenceville, a guy named Xander Orenstein. So he releases this guy for the mugging, and the guy doesn't show up for his court date. And the fact is that Orenstein apparently has done this before. He has let people out, again, with no bond. A guy who led police on a high-speed chase, and that guy was already out on bond for a different criminal offense. And then he was arrested and brought before Orenstein after the high-speed chase, and Orenstein releases him again. And of course, the guy doesn't show up in court again. Apparently, this magistrate goes against the recommendations of of what's called the pretrial services division. He released a New York man accused of bringing almost $2 million of fentanyl into Pittsburgh, again going against the recommendation in front of him, and that guy too fled. There have been calls for this Orenstein to be, I don't know what happens to judges who are considered, I guess he shows, oh, he's not, he's a thee and a they and a them. They say they will not resign, but the record that this person is creating is troublesome. And I say that as somebody who finds our bail system outrageous because it really only hits the poor. Anyone with any means, if bail is offered, can put the money down and walk. So the people that are sitting in our prison are people without means. They are not necessarily convicted of anything. So the cash bail system is, to me, so unjust and so classist that it is an outrage. But there are times when it, in fact, can allow for a clearly dangerous person to be held until their court date. And we see in this case that if this guy had held, that man who was stabbed to death on the Montour Trail would have gone jogging that day and gone home to his family. So, Xander Lowenstein, I don't know you from Adam, but you are building up a heck of a lousy record, buddy. And you are also making it harder for people like me who find our current bail system noxious to argue our case, because you clearly lacked the judicial wisdom to know when to allow someone without means to walk. And then the other local story that I can't, I'm just, I'm bemused by is what? The Pittsburgh police chief? He loves being a ref for college basketball, and that's what he had done before. He's always done. And I guess when he took the job, he said, okay, so I won't do that. But now he's asked to do it. And the mayor has said, all right, go ahead. And all hell's breaking loose. Because if you're the ref in college basketball, it means you travel, you have to referee a game in who knows where. I don't know. He's been traveling. And so people think, hey, as police chief, you're making a pretty good salary here. And that's one of those jobs where you're sort of on call all the time. And if you wanted to be a ref, maybe you shouldn't have taken the job. I have to say, I don't know, but I find it a curious kind of story, and I would love to hear other points of view on it. It just seems so, I don't know, unusual. It makes you think that he's not having a lot of fun with the job that pays him a lot. I'm sure he gets some money for being a ref. And I'm sure the refereeing is a heck of a lot more fun than being the police chief. But I don't know. Seems to me if you have a job that requires sort of 24/7 attention, being on call all the time, that maybe you should commit to that, which I guess he had done and then had a change of heart. Okay. Don't know if you saw this. I loved it in the New York Times book review. They always interview somebody about what are they reading, and if you could give a party and invite 3 writers, who would you? And they can be dead. Who would you have? Anyway, Colin Kaepernick was the person I think it was last Sunday, and I just want to share this one little response he gave. He was asked, "What kind of reader were you as a child, and do any childhood books stick with you?" And Kaepernick said this: "I was a reluctant reader because the books didn't resonate with me. It wasn't until I read We'll Never Forget You, Roberto Clemente, a book by Trudy Engel, that I saw myself in a story. And that has stuck with me ever since." So for that kid, Colin Kaepernick, who, the idea of reading a book was, what? That book about Roberto Clemente made him a reader. And he went on to say, "Kids are so impressionable. What they are reading and absorbing at a young age will stay with them forever. So it's important to make sure we give them great and empowering books to read that helps them lay a positive foundation for the rest of their lives." And he felt that way about that book, We'll Never Forget You, Roberto Clemente. And then I want to share with you another story. It was front page New York Times, but it was written by a local woman, sort of local, Ligonier, call that kind of local. And it touched me because I, like this writer, Darlin Brewer Hofstadt, feel love for trees, even for a tree. There is a tree in my neighborhood. It's not on my property, it's a few blocks away. But for the last 35 years, I cannot walk by it without stopping and laying my hands on it and even saying, "How you doing?" I love that tree. It's not particularly beautiful, but it's old, and it had this sort of carved out thing at its base on one side that when my son was still tiny and we would be walking and he in the stroller, we would get out at that tree and he would fit perfectly into that hollow at the base of this tree, and it held him. And I can't believe I never took a picture, but I don't know, so moved by it. And I worry about the tree because it is so old, and I see trees coming down left and right, and it just scares me. And so this woman, Darlin Brewer Hofstadt, wrote a story that ended up on the front page of the Thursday New York Times, that speaks of her love for a tree on her property that got sick. I'll just share some of it with you because it so touched me. When you live a long time with trees, they become a part of you. So it pained me to take down the old sugar maple. The tree was old when we moved to the farm 36 years ago, About the age of the farmhouse, we figured, 160 years. In her old age, she reached about 90 feet high, and I felt privileged to live under her canopy. But lately, the last few years, she has been battered by torrential rains and then drought. Summers are hotter, winters aren't as cold. She's had little snow cover to insulate her roots. Climate change probably made her more susceptible to the fungus that the forester said killed her. And I know I'm seeing that too. All our trees are so stressed. And this Darlin Hofstadt goes on to say, and she was not the only tree stressed. Ash trees have been decimated. Native dogwoods are dying. Hemlocks are being attacked. Sagebrush, sassafras. And she talks about all of the beetles, the viruses that are taking so much of our flora. She said woods that were once woods are becoming fields again. As she talks about desperately trying to save this tree, we pruned the dead limbs, we trimmed back a little longer, I begged. I knew I was too attached to her. My children had grown up beside her. Animals of all sorts scampered about her trunk. Black bears often ambled by her. At night, from the sleeping porch, I watched the moon circle east to west above her. She was more than just a tree. She was a village. And what, I wondered, had she witnessed in her long life? Horse and buggy, farmers who lived in log houses with corncob daubing, a barn raising, cold winters with piles of snow, many more birds, more insects, lots of bats, which are almost gone from the farm now. She lived in darker skies, brighter stars, years with no airplane noise, and then Flight 93 hijacked over her head. She'd watch the pond being dug, the house modernized, the land altered. Like the wrinkles on my face, her gnarly roots were a record of years gone by, of lives lived, the blessed and the painful. It's autumn now, and there is no longer that colorful array of red, yellow, and orange leaves blanketing the ground. The birds that once called her home have had to move on to sing elsewhere. Anyone who takes a tree down and doesn't feel this kind of sorrow, I do not comprehend. And one of the things that she did, because people had said this to her, turn it, don't burn it, meaning take the wood and make something of it. And so she called a guy in the area, a guy named Corey Snyder. And she says a couple months later, he presented me with three beautiful honey-colored bowls, one for our son, one for our daughter, and one for us. And now, instead of gazing up at the tree, I hold her in my hands. Anyway, I loved that. Hope you did too. And that's it for today. I be back tomorrow, I hope. And I hope you'll join me. Thank you so much.
Lynn Cullen Live, Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper or its advertisers.